Here for chapter 11 of Creature from Jeckyl Island, and actually on this chapter, preceding the previous chapter, so after the one that I just read, there's seems to be what's like a bunch of pictures in the middle of the book. So, and there's some, like captions with them. So we'll go through those first, and then we'll continue on with chapter 11. So let me just make sure that the stream is coming through here. Okay, we should be live. Not sure why it's not coming through on the stream end, but give it another moment. Sorry about that, y'all. Okay. Says we are live for 40 seconds. What is going on here? Okay, not sure what's going on here, but what a pain.
When it comes to your eyes, you don't want to take any
So
shortcuts.
it's gonna make me
Getting LASIK at Hoops Vision has changed my life, and it's changed the...
There we are. Hello, hello, what's up, everybody? So we're finally John live. The Morgal check. Good deal. Sorry about that, folks. So as I said, in case you couldn't hear me in the beginning, after the last chapter 10, seems like there's some pictures in the book with some captions and stuff. So we'll read through that, and then we'll go ahead and proceed to chapter 11. So this first picture, top left, Cecil Rhodes made one of the world's greatest fortunes of the 18th century. Financed by Nathan Rothschild and the Bank of England, he established a monopoly over the diamond output of South Africa, and most of the gold as well. He formed a secret society which included many of the top leaders of the British government. Their elitist goal was nothing less than world domination and the establishment of a modern feudalist society controlled by themselves through the world's central banks. In America, the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, was an outgrowth of that group. And so I've actually got queued up something that, of course, if you mention CFR, you can't do it without this clip of Hillary Clinton when I believe she was Secretary of State. Maybe I'm wrong, but basically just telling the world that she gets her orders from the top down from the CFR. So let's just check that out real quick.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future. I mean, Richard just...
So basically that's a Hillary Clinton admitting to no less than treason, but hey, what can you do about that sort of thing? So let's continue on looking at the pictures. Whoa, a little too far there. Let me scroll back up. Okay, so we all know who this dude in the middle is. But, okay, bottom left, August Belmont came to New York in 1837 as the financial agent of the Rothschilds. He funneled vast amounts of capital into American investments, often without anyone knowing whose money he was spending. The purpose of this concealment was to blunt the growing anti-Rothschild resentment that was then prevalent in Europe as well as in America. When his affiliation became commonly known, his usefulness came to an end, and he was replaced by J.P. Morgan. So here's a picture of J.P. Morgan in the center. J.P. Morgan Sr. was brought into banking by his father, Junius Morgan, in England. The Morgans were friendly competitors with the Rothschilds and became socially close to them. Morgan's London-based firm was saved from financial ruin in 1857 by the Bank of England, over which the Rothschilds held great influence. Thereafter, Morgan appears to have served as a Rothschild financial agent and went to great lengths to appear totally American. And then finally, John D. Rockefeller here on the right. John D. Rockefeller made his initial fortune in oil, but soon gravitated into banking and finance. His entry into the field was not welcomed by Morgan, and they became fierce competitors. Eventually, they decided to minimize their competition by entering into joint ventures. In the end, they worked together to create a national banking cartel called the Federal Reserve System. So here we go. Looks like we've got some Tartarian Antiquitech here. Nice little Easter egg, which is the Jeckyl Island mansion. So that's where they came up with the Federal Reserve concept way back in the early 1900s. And I would add as a side note, an interesting connection here with this J.P. Morgan guy is he was responsible for creating the guest list on the Titanic's maiden voyage. And it is kind of funny that some of the most powerful and influential banking interest sort of families like the Guggenheims and the Astors and very rich, wealthy families happen to be on the Titanic. Not Morgan himself, of course, but it does appear that more than a handful of very key influential people men died on the Titanic who potentially could have prevented or maybe slowed down or caught wind of this whole Federal Reserve System creation exactly 1 year or less than a year after the Titanic disaster, which again, J.P. Morgan basically invited all the guys that died on there. So it is an interesting connection, and there's a whole nother rabbit hole when it comes to the Titanic disaster, but we won't get into all that now. But it says here, this is the clubhouse for private resort on Jeckyl Island in Georgia, where the Federal Reserve System was conceived in great secrecy in 1910. It showed there shortly after completion. So I guess they conceived it prior to Titanic going down, but the Titanic went down, and then the Federal Reserve was actually established and implemented a year later. So there you have that. Okay, bottom left, Jacob Schiff was head of the New York investment firm Kuhn, Loeb & Co. He was one of the principal backers of the Bolshevik Revolution and personally financed Trotsky's trip from New York to Russia. He was a major contributor to Woodrow Wilson's presidential campaign and an advocate for the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. And we've got this political cartoon. Here we go, Wall Street. The Empire State Building. It says this cartoon by Robert Minor appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1911. It shows Karl Marx surrounded by enthusiastic Wall Street financiers. Morgan partner George Perkins, J.P. Morgan, John Ryan of National City Bank, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie. Immediately behind Marx is Teddy Roosevelt, leader of the Progressive Party. Here we go with Harry Dexter on the left and John Maynard Keynes on the right of this picture on the left here, the left page picture, were the theoreticians who guided the 1944 Bretton Woods Monetary Conference at which the IMF World Bank was created. White was a member of the Communist Party. Keynes was a member of the Fabian Society. They shared the same goal of international socialism. The IMF and World Bank has furthered that goal ever since. We'll skip over to the right. Edward Mandell House was the man who secured Woodrow Wilson's nomination for president and who thereafter became the hidden power at the White House. He negotiated a secret agreement to draw the U.S. into World War I at the very time Wilson was campaigning on the premise to keep America out of the war. On behalf of Wall Street, House lobbied Congress to pass the Federal Reserve Act. Going down to the bottom left, Raymond Robbins is shown here as the chairman of the Progressive Party convention in Chicago in 1912. He later became head of the American Red Cross mission in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. Although he represented Wall Street interests, he was a disciple of Cecil Rhodes and was anti-capitalist in his beliefs. He held great influence over Lenin. Then on the right, Carroll Quigley was a professor of history at Georgetown University. His book, Tragedy and Hope, revealed that the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, is an outgrowth of the secret society formed by Cecil Rhodes, whose name is, this is just my little side note here, so of course we know about Cecil Rhodes from the whole Rhodes Scholar thing, if nothing else. So it says here that Quigley wrote the history of how an international network of financiers has created a system of financial control able to dominate the political systems of all countries through their central banks. He named names and provided meticulous documentation, and of course his book was suppressed. Okay, on the left here we've got Winston Churchill, the first Lord of the Admiralty in World War I. As the Louisiana entered into an era where a German U-boat was known to be operating, he called off the destroyer escort that had been assigned to protect her. He calculated that the destruction of a British ship with U.S. passengers aboard would inflame American passions against Germany and help to create a political climate for coming into the war. And we've got here at the bottom left, Holton Deutsch. Lord Mercy on the right was put in charge of, well, maybe that caption above his head was wrong. It says Holton Deutsch here. Sorry about that. Lord Mercy is who it is on the right here. Was put in charge of an official inquiry into the sinking of the Louisiana. It was not an investigation but a cover-up. He was instructed by the Admiralty to place the entire blame on the captain of the ship. Mercy obeyed his orders but refused payment for his services and declined to accept further judicial assignments. In later years, he said that the affair was, quote, a damn dirty business, end quote. Okay, so this is section 3 of the book, The New Alchemy. The ancient alchemists sought in vain to convert lead into gold. Modern alchemists have succeeded in that quest. The lead bullets of war have yielded an endless source of gold for those magicians who control the mandrake mechanism. The startling fact emerges that without the ability to create fiat money, most modern wars simply would not have occurred. As long as the mechanism is allowed to function, future wars are inevitable. This is the story of how that came to pass. Chapter 11, The Rothschild Formula. The rise of the House of Rothschild in Europe, the tradition among financiers of profiting from both sides of an armed conflict, the formula by which war is converted into debt, and debt converted back into war. So far, we've adhered closely to the subject of money and the history of its manipulation by political and monetary scientists. Now we're going to take a short detour along a parallel path and view some of the same historical scenery from a different perspective. As we progress, it may seem that we have lost our way, and you may wonder what connection any of this can possibly have with the Federal Reserve System. Please be assured, however, it has everything to do with it, and when we finally return to that topic, the connection will have been painfully clear. The Profits of War. The focus of this chapter is on the profits of war, and more specifically, the tendency of those who reap those profits to manipulate governments into military conflicts, not for national or patriotic reasons, but for private gain. The mechanism by which this was accomplished in the past was more complex than simply lending money to warring governments and then collecting interest, although that was part of it. The real payoff has always been in the form of political favoritism in the marketplace. Writing in the year 1937, French historian Richard Louis-Jean explains, quote, "Although often called bankers, those who financed wars in the pre-capitalist period were not bankers in the modern sense of the word. Unlike modern bankers who operate with money deposited with them by their clients, or in more recent times created out of nothing by a central bank, they generally worked with the fortune which they themselves had amassed or inherited, and which they lent at a high rate of interest. Thus, those who risked the financing of a war were for the most part already very rich, and this was the case down to the 17th century. When they agreed to finance a war, these rich lenders did not, however, always attach great importance to the rate of interest. In this respect, they often showed the greatest compliance to their august clients. But in return, they secured for themselves privileges which could be turned into industrial or commercial profit, such as mining concessions, monopolies of sale or importation, or etc. Sometimes, even they were given the right to appropriate certain taxes as a guarantee of their loans. So, though the loan itself carried a very real risk and often did not bring much in interest, the indirect profits were very considerable, and the lender's leniency will be rewarded." End quote. The Rothschild Dynasty. No discussion of banking as a mechanism for financing wars would be complete without turning eventually to the name Rothschild. It was Mayer Amschel Rothschild who was quoted as saying, quote, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." End quote. Biographer Frederick Morton concluded that the Rothschild dynasty had, quote, "conquered the world more thoroughly, more cunningly, and much more lastingly than all the Caesars before or all the Hitlers after them." End quote. The dynasty was begun in Frankfurt, Germany, in the middle of the 18th century by Mayer Amschel Bauer, the son of a goldsmith. Mayer became a clerk in the Oppenheimer Bank in Hanover and was eventually promoted to junior partner. After his father's death, he returned to his home in Frankfurt to continue the family business. Over the door hung a red shield with an eagle as a sign to identify the establishment. The German words for red shield are Rothschild. So he changed his name from Bauer to Rothschild and added 5 gold arrows held in the talons of the eagle to represent his 5 sons. Pardon me. The Rothschild fortune began when Mayer adopted the practice of fractional reserve banking. As we've seen, he was not alone in this, but the House of Rothschild greatly surpassed the competition. That was due to his sharp business acumen and also because of his 5 most unusual sons, all of whom became financial power centers of their own. As they matured and learned the magic of converting debt into money, they moved beyond the confines of Frankfurt and established additional operations in the financial centers, not only of Europe, but much of the civilized world. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, the brothers conducted important transactions on behalf of the governments of England, France, Prussia, Austria, Belgium, Spain, Naples, Portugal, Brazil, various German states, and other smaller countries. They were the personal bankers of many of the crowned heads of Europe. They made large investments through agents in the markets as distant as the United States, India, Cuba, and Australia. They were financiers to Cecil Rhodes, making it possible for him to establish a monopoly over the diamond fields of South Africa. They are still connected with the De Beers. Biographer Derek Wilson writes, quote, "Those who lampooned or vilified the Rothschilds for their sinister influence had a considerable amount of justification for their anger and anxiety. The banking community had always constituted a fifth estate whose members were able, by their control of royal purse strings, to affect important events. But the House of Rothschild was immensely more powerful than any financial empire that had ever preceded it. It commanded vast wealth. It was international. It was independent. Royal governments were nervous of it because they could not control it. Popular movements hated it because it was not answerable to the people. Constitutionalists resented it because its influence was exercised behind the scenes, secretly. Secrecy, of course, is essential for the success of a cabal, and the Rothschilds perfected the art. By remaining behind the scenes, they were able to avoid the brunt of public anger, which was directed instead at the political figures which they largely controlled. This is a technique which has been practiced by financial manipulators ever since, and it is fully utilized by those who operate the Federal Reserve System today. Wilson continues, quote, Clandestinity was and remained a feature of Rothschild political activity. Seldom were they to be seen engaging in open public debate on important issues. Never did they seek government office. Even when in later years some of them entered Parliament, they did not feature prominently in the assembly chambers of London, Paris, or Berlin. Yet, all the while, they were helping to shape the major events of the day by granting or withholding funds, by providing statesmen with an official diplomatic service, by influencing appointments to high office, and by an almost daily intercourse with the great decision-makers. A fortune in smuggling. Continual war in Europe created excellent opportunities for profit from smuggling scarce consumer goods past military blockades. Since the Rothschilds often financed both sides in a conflict and were known to have great political influence, the mere sight of the red shield on a leather pouch, a carriage, or a ship's flag was sufficient to ensure that the messenger or his cargo could pass through checkpoints in either direction. This immunity allowed them to deal in a thriving black market for cotton goods, yarn, tobacco, coffee, sugar, and indigo, and they moved freely through the borders of Germany, Scandinavia, Holland, Spain, England, and France. This government protection was one of those indirect benefits that generated commercial profits far in excess of the interest received on the underlying government loans. It is generally true that one man's loss is another man's gain, and even the friendliest of biographers admit that for more than 2 centuries the House of Rothschild profited handsomely from wars and economic collapses, the very occasions on which others sustained the greatest losses. Napoleon versus the bankers. If one picture is worth 1,000 words, then one example surely must be worth a dozen explanations. There is no better example than the economic war waged by the financiers of 19th century Europe against Napoleon Bonaparte. It is an easily forgotten fact of history that Napoleon had restored law and order to a chaotic post-revolutionary France and had turned his attention not to war, but to establishing peace and improving economic conditions at home. He was particularly anxious to get his country and his people out of debt and out of the control of bankers. R. McNair Wilson in Monarchy or Money Power says, quote, It was ordained by him that money should not be exported from France on any pretext whatever, except with the consent of the government, and that in no circumstance should loans be employed to meet current expenditure, whether civil or military. One has only to consider, Napoleon remarked, quote, what loans can lead to in order to realize their danger. Therefore, I would never have anything to do with them and have always striven against them. End quote. For Napoleon, back to the original quote, the object was to withhold finance from the power to embrace the government as it had embarrassed the government of Louis XVI. When a government, Bonaparte declared, is dependent for money upon bankers, they and not the leaders of that government control the situation, since the hand that gives is above the hand that takes. Money, he declared, has no motherland. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain. End quote. One of Napoleon's first blows against the bankers was to establish an independent Bank of France with himself as president, but even this bank was not trusted, and government funds were never placed into it. It was his refusal to borrow, however, that caused the most concern among the financiers. Actually, to them, this was a mixture of both bad and good news. The bad news was that they were denied the benefit of royalty payments on fractional money. The good news was that, without resorting to debt, they were confident Napoleon could not militarily defend himself. Thus, he easily could be toppled and replaced by Louis XVI of the old monarchic dynasty, who was receptive to banker influence. Wilson continues, quote, "They had good hope of compassing his downfall. None believed that he could finance war on a great scale now that the resource of paper money had been denied him by the destruction of the assignat. Where would he obtain indispensable gold and silver to feed and equip a great army? Pitt, the Prime Minister of England, counted already on a coalition of England, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, and Sweden, and numerous small states. Some 600,000 men would be put into the field. All the resources of England's wealth, that is to say, all of the world's wealth, would be placed at the disposal of this overwhelming force. Could the Corsican muster 200,000? Could he arm them? Could he feed them? If the lead bullets did not destroy him, the gold bullets would soon make an end. He would be forced, like his neighbors, to come hat in hand for loans, like them to accept the banker's terms. He could not put his hands on £2,000,000, so empty was the treasury and so depleted the nation's stock of metallic money. London waited with interest to see how the puzzle would be solved." End quote. Napoleon solved the puzzle quite simply by selling off some real estate. Those crazy Americans gave him £3,000,000 for a vast swamp called Louisiana, a plan to destroy the United States. Napoleon did not want war, but he knew that Europe's financial rulers would not settle for peace, unless, of course, they were forced into it by the defeat of their puppet regimes, or unless, somehow, it would be to their monetary advantage. It was in pursuit of the latter tactic that he threatened to take direct possession of Holland, which then was ruled by his brother, King Louis. Napoleon knew that the Dutch were heavily in debt to the English bankers. If he would agree to leave Holland alone. The negotiations were handled by the banker Pierre César Labouchere, who was sent by the Dutch, and the English banker Sir Francis Baring, who was Labouchere's father-in-law. Although this was an attractive proposal to the bankers, at least on a short-term basis, it was still against their nature to forego the immense profits of war and mercantilism. They revised the proposal, therefore, to include a plan whereby both England and France would combine forces to destroy the newly independent United States and bring at least half of it, the industrial half, back under the domination of England. The incredible plan, conceived by the French banker Wouvard, called for military invasion and conquest, followed by the division of the spoils. England would receive the northern states, united with Canada, while the southern states would fall to France. Napoleon was to be tempted by offering him the awesome title of King of America. McNair Wilson tells us, quote, Labouchere wrote to Baring on 21st March and enclosed a note, British Foreign Secretary Wellesley, dictated by Wouvard, which ran, quote, "From a conqueror, he, or Napoleon, is becoming a preserver. The first result of his marriage with Marie-Louise will be that he will make an offer of peace to England. It is to this nation's, or England's, interest to make peace, for it has the command of the sea. On the contrary, It is really in the interest of France to continue war, which allows her to expand indefinitely and make a fresh fleet, which cannot be done once peace is established. Why does not the English cabinet make a proposal to France to destroy the United States of America, and by making them again dependent on England, persuade Napoleon to lend his aid to destroy the life work of Louis XVI? It is to her, or to England's, interest to conclude peace and to flatter Napoleon's vanity by recognizing his work and his imperial title. The cabinet discussed the proposals and approved them. Wellesley at once hurried to Baring's house to give him the good news. The Dutch would be able to pay, and would be compelled to pay in gold. Unhappily, Napoleon found out what was afoot and took somewhat strong objections to the plan of a joint attack on the United States. He arrested Orvrard, dismissed and exiled Fouché, and published the whole story, to the grave distress of Wellesley and Baring. End quote. It must not be concluded from this that Napoleon was a paragon of virtue or a champion of honest money. His objection to the bankers was that their monetary power was able to threaten the sovereignty of his own political power. He allowed them a free hand while they served the purpose of the state. Then, when the need for military financing subsided, he would condemn them for making, quote, unholy profits, and simply take it from them in the name of the people. If the bankers protested, they were sent to prison. And so the battle lines were drawn. Napoleon had to be destroyed at all costs. To make this possible, the Bank of England created vast new amounts of fiat money to, quote, lend to the government so it could finance an overpowering army. A steady stream of gold flowed out of the country to finance the armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The economy staggered once again under the load of war debt, and the little people paid the bill with hardly a grumble because they hadn't the slightest knowledge it was being charged to their account. Wilson concludes the story. Quote, the bankers won. Louis XVIII was restored by British arms and British diplomacy to the throne of his ancestors. Loans were placed at his disposal though Napoleon had left a France which enjoyed a credit balance. A year later, the man whom every king and every banker in Europe called usurper won back his throne with 800 men and without the firing of a single shot. On this occasion, he had no option but to raise a loan for the defense of France. The city of London, or banking district, accommodated him with £5 million. With this sum, he equipped the army which Wellington defeated at Waterloo. End quote. Gold for the Duke of Wellington. One of the most fascinating and revealing episodes to be recorded by Rothschild biographers concerns the smuggling of a large shipment of gold to finance the Duke of Wellington, who was attempting to feed and equip an army in Portugal and in the Pyrenees Mountains between Spain and France. It was not at all certain that Wellington would be able to defeat Napoleon in the coming battle, and the Duke was hard-pressed to convince bankers and merchants in Portugal and Spain to accept his written promise to pay, even though they were officially guaranteed by the British government. These notes were deeply discounted, and Wellington was desperate for gold coin. It was at this point that Nathan Rothschild offered the services of himself and his brothers. With an efficient smuggling apparatus already functioning throughout Europe, he was able to offer Wellington much better terms while still making a magnificent profit. But to accomplish this, the gold had to pass right under Napoleon's nose. Frederick Morton describes the scene. Quote, there was only one way to route the cash, through the very France England's army was fighting. Through the very France which England's army was fighting. Of course, the Rothschilds' blockade running machine already had superb cogs whirring all over Germany, Scandinavia, and England, even in Spain and southern France. But a very foxy new wheel was needed in Napoleon's capital itself. Enter Jacob, henceforth called James, the youngest of Mayer's sons. End quote. James was only 19 years old, but was well trained by his father in the art of deception. He arrived in Paris with a dual mission. First, he was to provide the French authorities with a false report about the British gold movement, with just enough truth in it to sound convincing. He presented the government with falsified letters indicating that the English were desperate to halt the flow of their gold into France. The ploy paid off when the French authorities then actually encouraged the financial community to accept British gold and to convert it into commercially sound banknotes. Second, James was to serve as a vital link in a financial chain stretching between London and Pyrenees. He was to coordinate the receipt of the gold into France, the conversion of that gold into Spanish banknotes, and the movement of those notes out of the country on their way to Wellington. All of this he did with amazing dexterity, especially considering his youth. Morton concludes, quote, "In the space of a few hundred years, Mayer's youngest had not only gotten the English gold rolling through France, but conjured a fiscal mirage that took in Napoleon himself. A teenage Rothschild tricked the imperial government into sanctioning the very process that helped to ruin it." The family machine began to hum. Nathan sent big shipments of British guineas, Portuguese gold ounces, French Napoleon's D, or often freshly minted in London, across the Channel. From the coast, James saw them to Paris and secretly transmuted the metal into bills on certain Spanish bankers. South of the capital, Cowman, another of Mayer's sons, materialized, took over the bills, blurred into 1,000 shadowed canyons along the Pyrenees, and reappeared with Wellington's receipts in hand. Solomon, another son, was everywhere, troubleshooting, making sure the transit points were diffuse and obscure enough not to disturb either the French delusion or the British guinea rate. Amsel stayed in Frankfurt and helped Father Mayer to staff headquarters. The French did catch a few whiffs of the truth. Sometimes the suspicious could be prosperously purged of their suspicion. The police chief of Calais, for example, suddenly was able to live in such distracting luxury that he found it difficult to patrol the shoreline thoroughly. While Napoleon struggled his might away in the Russian winter, there passed through France itself a gold vein to the army staving in the empire's back door. At a dinner party in later years, I guess that was end quote on that, and then at a dinner party in later years, Nathan actually summed up the episode as though it were merely a good piece of routine business. He said, quote, "The East India Company had 800,000 pounds worth of gold to sell. I went to the sale and bought it all. I knew the Duke of Wellington must have it. The government sent for me and said they must have the gold. I sold the gold to them, but they didn't know how to get it to the Duke in Portugal. I undertook all that and sent it through France. It was the best business I've ever done." End quote. The Battle of Waterloo. The final outcome of the battle at Waterloo between Wellington and Napoleon was crucial to Europe, both politically and economically. If Napoleon had been victorious, England would have been in even greater economic trouble than before. Not only would she have lost international power and prestige, but even at home her subjects would have been further disgruntled over such great personal and financial wartime sacrifices. Her defeat almost surely would have resulted in not being able to repay the great amounts she had borrowed to conduct the war. In the London Stock Exchange, therefore, where British government bonds were traded along with their securities, everyone waited anxiously for news of the outcome. It was well known that the Rothschild had developed a private courier service that was used not only to transport gold and other tangible cargo, but to rapidly move information that could be useful in making investment decisions. It was expected, therefore, that Nathan in London would be the first to know the name of the victor after the cannon smoke had cleared from the battlefield. And they were not to be disappointed. The first news of Wellington's victory arrived in Brussels around midnight on June 18, 1815, where a Rothschild agent named Rothworth was waiting in the readiness. He immediately mounted a fresh horse and set off for the port of Ostend, where a boat was standing by to speed him across the Channel to London. In the early hours of June 20th, the exhausted messenger was pounding on Nathan's door, a full 24 hours before Wellington's own courier, Major Henry Percy, arrived. At least one friendly biographer claims that Nathan's first act was to deliver the news to the Prime Minister, but that government officials were hesitant at first to believe it because it ran contrary to reports that they had received previously telling of serious British setbacks. At any rate, there is no doubt that Nathan's second act of the morning was to set off for the Stock Exchange to take up a position at his usual pillar. All eyes were upon him as he slumped dejectedly, staring at the floor. Then he raised his gaze and, with pained expression, began to sell. The whisper went through the crowded room, "Nathan selling? Nathan selling? Wellington must have lost. Our government bonds will never be repaid. Sell them now! Sell, sell, sell!" Prices therefore tumbled, and Nathan sold again. Prices plummeted, and still Nathan sold. Finally, prices collapsed altogether, and in one quick move, Nathan reversed his call and purchased the entire market in government bonds. In a matter of just a few hours, he had acquired the dominant holding of England's entire debt at but a tiny fraction of its worth. Cydonia. Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of England, wrote a book in 1844 called Coningsby. It was a political novel in which the author expressed his views about contemporary issues. One of the strong characters in the book was a financier named Cydonia, but every detail of Cydonia's actions was an exact replica of the real Lord Rothschild, whom Disraeli greatly admired. In the guise of a novel, we read about Rothschild's emigration from Germany, his family and banking ties throughout Europe, his handling of the gold for Wellington, and his financial coup after Waterloo. Then Disraeli wrote, quote, Europe did require money, and Cydonia was ready to lend it to Europe. France wanted some, Austria more, Prussia a little, Russia a few millions. Cydonia could furnish them all. It is not difficult to conceive that after having pursued the career we have intimated for about 10 years, Cydonia had become one of the most considerable personages in Europe. He had established a brother, or a near relative, in whom he could confide, in most of the principal capitals. He was lord and master of the money market of the world, and of course virtually lord and master of everything else. He literally held the revenues of southern Italy in pawn, and monarchs and ministers of all countries courted his advice and were guided by his suggestions. End quote. That Disraeli was not exaggerating was made clear by the boast of James Rothschild himself. When U.S. Treasury agents approached him in Paris in 1842 with a request for a loan to the American government, he said to them, quote, "You have seen the man who is at the head of the finances of Europe." End quote. There have always been men who were in a position to make private fortunes out of cooperating with both sides in a war. The Rothschilds were not unique in this, but they no doubt perfected the art and became the personification of that breed. They were not necessarily evil in a moral sense. What preoccupied their minds were not questions of right or wrong, but profit and loss. This analytical indifference to human suffering was aptly described by one Rothschild when he said, quote, "When the streets of Paris are running with blood, I buy." End quote. They may have held citizenship in the country of their residence, but patriotism was beyond their comprehension. They were also very bright, if not cunning, and these combined traits made them the role model of the cool pragmatists who dominate the political and financial world of today. Disraeli well described this type when he wrote of Cydonia again. Quote, "He was a man without affections. It would be harsh to say he had no heart, for he was susceptible of deep emotions, but not for individuals. The individual never touched him. Woman was to him a toy, man a machine." End quote. It would seem that an absence of patriotism and a cold, analytical outlook would lead financiers to avoid making loans to governments, particularly foreign ones. Private borrowers can be hauled into court and their assets confiscated to make good on their debts, but governments control the legalized use of force. They are the courts. They are the police. Who will seize their assets? The answer is another government. Speaking of a relatively modern example of this principle, Ron Chernow explains, quote, "The new alliance between the monetary and political scientists was mutually advantageous. Washington wanted to harness the new financial power to coerce foreign governments into opening their markets to American goods for adopting pro-American policies. The banks, in turn, needed levers to force debt repayment and welcome the government's police powers in distant places. The threat of military intervention was an excellent means by which to speed loan repayment. When Kuhn, Loeb, if they do not pay, who will collect these customs duties? End quote. Castle replied, your Marines and ours. One of the great puzzles of history is why governments always go into debt and seldom attempt to put themselves on a pay-as-you-go basis. A partial answer is that kings and politicians lack the courage to tax their subjects the enormous sums that would be required under such an arrangement. There is also the deeper question of why the expenditures are so high in the first place. Given the mentality of the world's financial lords and masters, as Disraeli described them, it is conceivable that a coldly calculated strategy has been developed over the years to ensure this result. In fact, the historical evidence strongly suggests that such a plan was developed in the 18th century Europe and perfected in 20th century America. For the purposes of hypothetical analysis, let us identify this strategy as the Rothschild Formula. The formula. Let's imagine a man who is totally pragmatic. He's smarter and more cunning than most men, and in fact holds them in thinly disguised contempt. He may respect the talents of a few, but has little concern over the condition of mankind. He has observed that kings and politicians are always fighting over something or other, and has concluded that wars are inevitable. He also has learned that wars can be profitable, not only by lending or creating the money to finance them, but from government favoritism in the granting of commercial subsidies or monopolies. He is not capable of such a primitive feeling as patriotism, so he is free to participate in the funding of any side in any conflict, limited only by factors of self-interest. If such a man were to survey the world around him, it is not difficult to imagine that he would come to the following conclusions, which would become the prime directives of his career. 1. War is the ultimate discipline to any government. If it can successfully meet the challenge of a war, it will survive. If it cannot, it will perish. All else is secondary. The sanctity of its laws, the prosperity of its citizens, and the solvency of its treasury will be quickly sacrificed by any government in its primal act of self-survival. 2. All that's necessary, therefore, is to ensure that a government will maintain or expand its debt, is to involve it in a war or the threat of war. The greater the threat and the more destructive the war, the greater the need for debt. 3. To involve a country in war or the threat of war, it will be necessary for it to have enemies with credible military might. If such enemies already exist, all the better. If they exist but lack military strength, it will be necessary to provide them with the money to build their war machine. If an enemy does not exist at all, then it will be necessary to create one by financing the rise of a hostile regime. 4. The ultimate obstacle is a government which declines to finance its wars through debt. Although this seldom happens, when it does, it will be necessary to encourage internal political opposition, insurrection, or revolution to replace that government with one that is more compliant to our will. The assassination of heads of state could play an important role in this process. 5. No nation can be allowed to remain militarily stronger than its adversaries, for that could lead to peace and a reduction of debt. To accomplish this balance of power, it may be necessary to finance both sides of the conflict. Unless one of the combatants is hostile to our interests and therefore must be destroyed, neither side should be allowed a decisive victory or decisive defeat. While we must always proclaim the virtues of peace, the unspoken objective is perpetual war. Whether anyone actually put this strategy into words or passed it along from generation to generation is not important. In fact, it is doubtful it has ever worked that way. Whether it is the product of conscious planning or merely the consequence of men responding to the profit opportunities inherent in fiat money, the world's financial lords have acted as though they were following such a plan, and this has become especially apparent since the creation of the central bank mandrake mechanism 3 centuries ago. The balance of power question is particularly intriguing. Most history texts present the concept as though it were some kind of natural social phenomenon which somehow has worked to the benefit of mankind. The implication is that it's just wonderful how, after all those European wars, no nation was strong enough to completely dominate the others. When the United States emerged from World War II with exactly such power, it was widely deplored, and massive political or financial mechanisms such as foreign aid and disarmament were set in motion to restore the balance. This has become almost a revered doctrine of international democracy. But the overlooked consequence of this sentimental notion is that wars between equals have become the permanent landscape of history. This does not mean that every warlike group that comes along will find easy financing from the lords and masters. It depends on whom they threaten and how likely they are to succeed. In 1830, for example, the Dutch were facing an uprising of their subjects in Belgium. Both the ruling government and the revolutionaries were dependent upon the Rothschilds for financing this conflict. The Dutch rulers were reliable customers for loans, and just as important, they were reliable in their payment of interest on those loans. It would have been foolhardy to provide more than token assistance to the rebels who, if they came to power, quite likely would have refused to honor the debts of the former puppet regime. Solomon Rothschild explained, quote, "These gentlemen should not count on us unless they decide to follow a line of prudence and moderation. Our goodwill does not yet extend to the point of putting clubs into the hands that would beat us, that is, lending money to make war and ruin the credit that we sustain with all our efforts and all our means." End quote. After the revolution was resolved by negotiation rather than arms, the new government in Brussels was a natural target for financial takeover. James Rothschild laid out the strategy that has become the model of such operations ever since. Now is the moment of which we should take advantage to make ourselves absolute masters of that country's finances. The first step will be to establish ourselves on an intimate footing with Belgium's new finance minister to gain his confidence, and to take all the treasury bonds he may offer us. End quote. Perpetual war in 18th century England. Wars, great and small, have always been a plague on Europe, but it was not until they were easy to finance through central banking and fiat money that they became virtually perpetual. For example, the following war chronicles begin immediately following the formation of the Bank of England, which, as you recall, was created for the specific purpose of financing a war. 1689 to 1697, the War of the League of Augsburg. 1702 to 1713, the War of Spanish Succession. 1739 to 1742, the War of Jenkins' Ear. 1744 through 1748, the War of Austrian Succession. 1754 through 1763, the French and Indian War. 1793 through 1781, the War against Revolutionary France. and 1803 to 1815, the Napoleonic Wars. In addition to these European conflicts, there also were two wars with America, the War for Independence and the War of 1812. In the 126 years between 1689 and 1815, England was at war 63 of them. That is 1 out of every 2 years in combat. The others were spent preparing for combat. The mark of the Rothschild Formula is unmistakable in these conflicts. The monetary scientists often were seen financing both sides. Whether ending in victory or defeat, the outcome merely preserved or restored the European, quote, balance of power. And the most permanent result of any of these wars was expanded government debt for all parties. Summary. By the end of the 18th century, the House of Rothschild had become one of the most successful financial institutions the world has ever known. Its meteoric rise can be attributed to the great industry and shrewdness of the five brothers who established themselves in various capitals of Europe and forged the world's first international financial network. As pioneers in the practice of lending money to governments, they soon learned that this provided unique opportunities to parlay wealth into political power as well. Before long, most of the princes and kings of Europe had come within their influence. The Rothschilds also had mastered the art of smuggling on a grand scale, often with the tacit approval of the governments whose laws they violated. This was perceived by all parties that they'd be providing funds for the enemy was pragmatically ignored. Thus, a time-honored practice among financiers was born, profiting from both